Welcome to Leadership, the secret sauce, where extraordinary coaches and leaders reveal what makes them exceptional. We're your hosts, Dave Lipsky and Matt Dotson. Together, let's discover our guest's secret sauce. Today's episode is brought to you by Character Matters Coaching and Consulting. At Character Matters, we believe great leadership isn't just about results. It's about who you become along the way. From career transitions to team building, we help leaders unlock clarity, build resilience, and lead authentically. Because when character grows, impact follows. Visit charactermatterscoaching.com. Today's episode is supported completely unofficially by a community we deeply believe in, the International Coaching Federation's Coaching in Organizations. If you're building or leading an internal coaching program, this is where your people find their people. It's a space to swap real stories, sharpen your craft, and stay connected to what's emerging in our field. If you haven't joined yet, take a moment to sign up and plug into the conversations shaping the future of organizational coaching. Your community is waiting, and they're ready to learn with you. Go to coachingfederation.org/coaching-in-organizations-inquiry to get started. All right, welcome. Today, we're sitting down with David Drake to uncover his secret sauce. We're going to get into the story, his challenges, things he's learned along the way. I think you want to stick around. But if before I forget, please don't forget to subscribe and like this episode. It helps us, and it's doing our part in cascading secret sauce throughout the blogosphere and the podcast world, so that people hear the stories of coaches and what their secret sauce is. So, Dave, who do we have on the podcast today?
I am very excited to welcome in my friend David, who I've been working with over the years in different capacities. Matt and I created this podcast so we could talk to coaches and learn a little more about what they do, and we're really excited to have you on. We're going to get to intros in a second, but just on a scale from 1 to 10, 1 being low, 10 being high, what is your energy level at the present moment, David?
I would say it's about a 6. It was a 4, but now I'm on the call, so now it's bumped up to a 6. Only because I've had a little bit of surgery this morning. So, but my mind feels sharp, and I'm in a good mood, and so my body's just kind of resting as we speak. So,
we're sending you healthy waves.
Thanks.
And where are you calling in from this morning?
I'm at home in Amsterdam.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Matt, how about you?
I would say probably an 8.5. I was going to say 8.76, but or 867-5309 for those in the 80s.
When I actually grew up that was the prefix where I grew up. So we actually knew the person that had that phone number.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Anyway, for those of you listeners that don't know what we're talking about, you could just Google it.
Just ask Jenny. She knows.
Yeah.
Yeah, the person wasn't named Jenny, were they? No. Wow. I'm about a 7.75.
Ooh.
Fighting a little bit of a cough, but really excited about the conversation. So, David, you're on plane, train, or plane or train, and the person next to you introduces themselves, says, "Hi. What do you do? How do you introduce yourself?"
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think part of why I picked coaching as a destination eventually was because it covered a pretty wide ground. And after I left my very first career, I never really found a simple word to describe what I do. And actually, I built 2 bodies of work to actually create a theoretical structure around what I do so that people could understand. But I would say that mostly I hold space for people who are trying to make a significant change. And that can be at the level of a state government, all the way down to an individual who's struggling with existential issues. And one of my fascinations in that because I have a weird brain, and I've worked on a lot of technology projects. So I've helped like companies like Nike solve major technology problems. Even though I'm not a technology expert, what I'm really good at is noticing patterns and sensing into fields. And so most of the time, it's not the technology that's the problem; it's the people that are the problem. And so I helped redesign, um, yeah, two major functions in a state government. I've helped all kinds of organizations kind of sort out how do we actually manage change at scale, and I find that really fascinating. And to do that, built two bodies of work to allow myself to roam. So I roam and move in and out of systems to kind of get a sense for where might some energy come that might be useful to them.
David, could you share with us, like, first is, what is your secret sauce, and when or how did you know? Like, you talked about something we haven't had a lot of our guests talk about in terms of like this idea around this intuitive sense or sensing. Tell us a little bit about your secret sauce. And
Well, it's one of the gifts of getting older is that things I used to judge about myself as negative actually have turned out to be my greatest strengths.
mm,
So I grew up in a family with two very, very active younger brothers. But I was always very quiet. I preferred to be outside. I preferred to be in nature, um, and I was more quiet and studious. And I never really. And I Some would label me as shy. I was very bright and very shy. I was very. But I remember once there was when I was in high school. We were leaving. Some of us had gone out to have some ice cream or something, and this woman. Anyways, I won't tell you the whole story, but just the punchline of the story. She said, "I just watch you watch us. You see all these things that are happening, like who's attracted to whom and yeah." And so I thought I had never really thought of it that way. And what I realized that my sauce has sort of two halves of it, because one kind of contributes to the other. So one half is when I coach, I am actually profoundly still. And I'm very good at creating space. And as an example, when I was at the Institute of Coaching conference in Boston a few weeks ago, we did a demo on stage. And one of the women afterwards said, I was sitting in the back of the room, and even though there was all kinds of nightmares with the microphones, she said, I could feel the space you were holding from the very back of the auditorium room. And so I said, well, thank you. And I got a lot of appreciation for that. And so half of the secret sauce is being able to sit in silence and create a sense of safety for people pretty quickly. It often means that in coaching, I don't talk very much because I don't need to. But the other half of that is I can do that because I trust my ability to sense what's happening and to see and feel and notice things that most coaches overlook. And so I feel like it allows me to get to the crux of people's issues much sooner. It's the most common feedback we give new students of narrative coaching, which is please stop coaching. You're missing most of what's actually happening right in front of you. And then when I explain to them what's happening in front of you, well, how did you know? I didn't see that. How did you notice that? Yeah, because you're trying so hard to coach. And when I used to travel the world before the pandemic and do demonstrations like for graduate coaching programs, I would often be obviously coaching one of their students, and many of them would say, "You got them to say more in 5 minutes or 10 minutes than we've gotten them to say all year. Like, how did you do that? You didn't even say anything hardly." And I said, "My job as a coach is not to say things. Sometimes I will if I need to, but I would say my secret sauce is again, which I judge myself for, is being shy and bright as a child before nerds were cool. Was not a fun thing in the 50s and 60s. Um, and for me, I just saw it as a deficit. But I've later realized it's just another way of being in the world, and actually gives me a lot of superhero strengths that I really appreciate.
can you share a little bit around how you came to coaching? So, like, obviously those systems sort of didn't develop overnight. Where
No.
was your sort of first, like, that you heard about it that you thought, maybe that has some draw to me?
Well, it was a very random encounter. So at the time I was transitioning out of my first career, I had been a chaplain. I had been a minister for about 5 years, a Presbyterian minister. I wasn't very religious even then, but I loved a lot about community and service and church and spiritual formation. And seminary was fantastic. I loved it. It was my favorite of all my degrees in some ways. In the end, it was too limiting of a field for me, but the when I was transitioning out of that, I said, well, what does that actually qualify me for? And then I started to realize I'm good at stories. I'm good at being with people. I'm good at helping people communicate. And so I was kind of finding my way um, into mostly into change management because I realized that's really a lot of what I had been doing. I wrote a book in Nicaragua. I started a national newsletter for sanctuary churches, and I just liked helping facilitate change. And so I started to do some bigger projects, looking at individual transitions in organizations and organizational change. And then one day I was walking down the street or somewhere in Portland, Oregon, where I lived for a long time, and I saw this like cheesy flyer for a coaching seminar in Santa Monica. Now, I'm from, I don't know what that means something to you, but if
Santa
you're
Monica.
nodding as if you do. So I thought, yeah, there you go. And I said, and I'm very intuitive, and I said, I need to go to that. I think it's going to be important. So I went down there, and I walked. This gives you a lot about this was in the mid 1990s, so this is 30 years ago, in Santa Monica. So the vast majority of people there were multi-level marketers and not my crowd of people at all. But I loved what the guy was saying on stage. This guy named Jay Perry, I think he's from New Jersey. He was an early pioneer in the coaching space. I said, I want to do what he's doing, but not with these people. They're lovely human beings, but just not my cup of tea. So I came back and started. Back then, there were no real coaching books much, and then I was doing all these like managers coach, leaders coach program. It wasn't called that yet, but that's what they became. So we cobbled together um, uh, uh, some programs like that. I did that for a university and for some large clients, and found that I just really enjoyed it. I didn't really fit the profile of the typical coach. So I kind of found my way through the side door of publication. So I started writing and thinking a lot about coaching. So a lot of it was a lot of hoo-ha back then. That's a technical term. And it still is in some ways, and I said, that's not how change actually works. And I didn't have the personality to fit in easily, but I really found my tribe in the academic coaching space. And I've now published, I think, over 80 publications, probably more than anybody in the world that's not at a university. And I've co-edited the most prestigious coaching handbook in the world. And I love thinking about people and how to make them do better. Yeah, and so for me, I just kept wandering my way and found that I had a knack for teaching coaching. Went back to school, got a PhD, and out of that created narrative coaching, which I've now taught all over the world. Um, and then, like I said, I've developed 3 other bodies of work all around how to help create scaffolding for things like how do we reimagine training and in organizations, most of which is very ineffective and very expensive. And so we've done we almost won a huge project with Google, but then it got lost in a political firefight. But their team loved it because it was very practical and very simple and didn't have a lot of fancy leadership words. It was just about getting stuff done. And so I just like being able to noodle on things and coaching. Again, I'm not like most coaches, but that's one of the beauties of coaching is that there's a lot of ways to play. And so I've contributed a lot to the profession. I don't call myself a coach anymore. I have not for probably 5 or 10 years. I find it a very limiting label for me. It works well for others, and so I just said, I'm David, and here's what I can offer. Is any of that useful to you? And so again, I like wandering around and talking to people and noticing things and and liking
Mm.
helping people help themselves. And so I created academic and intellectual architecture to help them do that. And so I've had a number of just wonderful, brave clients willing to state the obvious. Most of what we do to develop people
Mm.
at work does not work at all. And so people that are willing to go try something different, and on the vast majority of cases, it's extraordinarily effective.
What do you think is the biggest resistance? Like, if the stuff that we do in the corporate world or sometimes at work to try to
Mm,
develop people isn't working? Because I think there's enough people that are saying, hey, look,
mm,
this is maybe we're sort of keep on pushing a flawed model
yeah,
or a flawed practice. I would say
yeah,
it's even more, simple than a model. Just we keep throwing money after something
yeah.
that's not working. But what would you say about that?
I would agree. And so there's some really fascinating sort of dark history about how the American school system was born. And I'll just speak about the States. It's the country I know the best. That's where I was born. And some of the Rockefellers and people like that, did a lot. Were very generous in donating money for libraries and schools and whatnot. But they also funded things that led to standardized testing and a lot of things that are just not very productive. But and the curriculum of an American high schools, was borrowed from places over 100 years ago, has no real logical sense. And so we have this sort of industrial notion about education. And for me, it just goes against everything we know about human beings. And so I remember when my daughter was in high school, and she's very smart, but isn't easily structured, and the high school was kind of hard for her in places. But I said, Hannah, but look, so you've got the highest marks in the class and the hardest history classes. You have the English teacher everybody else is afraid of. You got the highest grade in your class. So what do you notice about that? Oh, these are people that take me seriously and really challenge me, and then I thrive. The rest of it's
Mm.
BS. And I said, yes, high school is a game. If you play the game well, you get more choices. College is a game. If you play it well, you get more choices. I said, but never forget that it's a game. It may or may not have anything to do with your actual education. And I said, so those three teachers in high school changed your life. You will find them wherever you go. Give everything to them and just get by the rest, right? And so we just export this sort of pedagogical approach, which isn't even good for children, let alone for high school students, college students, or adults. But we export that into companies. And you have the forgetting curve. You have all this data, which shows again and again and again that it doesn't work, and we still try to sell as if we're at Walmart, right? With look at all these beautiful things on the shelf, and we hype all this stuff. But then you look at one of the things when I would try to sell this to clients, I would just model that for them in the interview. And one of my favorite questions was, "What is a hobby you have that many people at work don't know about?" And we would find like secret violin makers, and just I make the world's best zucchini bread, or well, tell me how you came to make great zucchini bread.
Mm.
Well, it didn't, like never did somebody say, I went to a course on zucchini bread making. Well, my grandmother made it. I always loved going to her house as a kid. And I vowed when I got older, and then they'd tell me the story about their grandmother and where they grew up.
Mm.
And then one thing led to another. And I said, nowhere in there did you need a course or coaching about zucchini bread. You might have had some mentoring in there, maybe, but he, you know, so a lot of the work in integrative development, which is one of the fields I've created, a lot of it's drawn from progressive child psychologists and child educators. If infants don't learn, they don't survive well on their own. We instinctively are hardwired to learn, just like every other animal on the planet. But then that goes great until they get to school. And I remember, and I was a pretty shy kid, but I remember like the first week of kindergarten, I remember this, the teacher told us, it's time for a nap. And I said, I'm not tired. And then she's like, it's time for a nap. Why is it time for a nap? I'm not tired.
Mm.
And so that's sort of a representative of, and so like if you send 30 of your employees to the same workshop on X, presentation skills, conflict resolution. Everyone has their own agenda, their own history, their own triggers, their own needs, their own motivations. There's no curriculum on the planet that would serve all 30 people. And so and what we also discovered, and I learned this from the guy that built all the famous programs at GE, that we keep sending changed, even when we are effective at training, we send changed people back into unchanged environments, and the environment always wins. It either contorts them back to where they were before or spits them out. So we, in our work, we help people change their environment to make it easier for them to thrive. And in the course of doing so, we don't teach them. We ask them to explore, what are you noticing you might need to learn more about as you're trying to change your own environment? And then we say, who do you know around you is really good at that? So they end up creating peer mentoring. And then who has authority or power in the space? How can you influence them? What do you know about this topic that might be helpful here? And so then we mobilize people to change themselves. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm fascinated with that, David. So, it sounds like it takes a long time to change an environment. So, question is, well, maybe, and actually, I saw it. Maybe it doesn't. How long does it take, and how can you accelerate it?
Yeah, so you need a sponsor. It's almost never from HR. It's from somebody in the business who has a business problem that they're trying to solve. And so, like, one of my favorite projects was with the CFO of the second largest bank in Australia, the least likely person you would think, but we got way more done with half the budget, half the time, as the really fancy business school programs I was asked to do for the rest of the bank. So most of the time I was on a retainer for between 1 and, in some cases, 3 years, depending on the size of the company and the size of the amount of change. And in that, I said, you have X amount of hours, and I will be and do whatever we need to do as we discover. And it takes a sponsor, somebody with authority to make, within that zone of sphere of influence, make things happen. And then, and the beauty of this for me was that, like, I think about the very first project I ever had where I sold this as the entire frame for the project. It was a agency that served disabled children and their families, so young children 0 to 5. And one of their issues was, when they started, they had 2 primary languages of their families, English and then a fair bit of Spanish. At that point in time, I think they had 28 primary languages, 24 of which or so nobody in the organization spoke. Huge cultural complexity, the whole 9 yards. And their numbers were really following because of the legal environment, the bureaucratic environment. And so they said, we need to get better. And so for me, one of the beauties of this for me was, I think in those 2 years, I might have, outside of the very first orientation, done 2 workshops. All the rest was pure learning and pure observation. And at the end of that, they now had the highest scores in the state, and actually got the government to actually rewrite policy and regulations to support other programs to do the exact same thing. So it had a ripple effect. Then I worked with a couple of other counties to do the same. And then we had enough data to show that, again, these new regulations were helpful and that children were thriving because of the way we completely reframed how they saw their business. And so for me, on paper, it takes more time in terms of length of time, because it just takes time. But I think about, like, in terms of actual face time for me or cost of me, it was no more than if I'd done a whole bunch of workshops for them. Matter of fact, it was actually cheaper because we didn't waste our time doing workshops. You learned as you needed things. And then I created one of the world's first wikis inside a company, one of my clients, so that everything we learned was available to everybody else for free. I wrote all my own contracts, which made everything we created open source. You couldn't sell it as a company, but you could use it in any way you wanted, which meant that people could come into our resource center and just take stuff and go experiment. And our own expectation was, you have to come back and tell us what happened. So they became a learning ecosystem in themselves. And like I said, we did hardly any programs. When we started, we always did an orientation for about half a day around mindfulness, ethnography, which is the ability to notice your environment in a way, and what was the third one we did? I don't remember now. So I think it's rudimentary narrative coaching skills. And
Mm.
but I remember, like, so when I saw this, I ended up doing a 3-year project with PwC in Australia. Not an easy client. They replaced McKinsey with me, so that's what they were like aiming for. And I did the same thing with them. I got there. One of their small teams of about 25 people, and the 2 HR people that supported them. We did that like 2 or 3 hour workshop on those 3 things, and then we sent them off to observe themselves and each other in their team in action. And these poor young human capital people were just petrified. They were used to McKinsey, like, here's a $50,000 assessment, here's all this crap, but I said, no, we don't need any of that. And we're going to help them notice themselves, because if this is going to work, they've got to change. And so I remember when people came back, they were just dreading it. I know I'm going to lose my job. I've failed. I took all the risk. What did David get us into? And then I said, well, just wait, we'll see. And then I think we had allotted like half an hour, 45 minutes for a check-in. 3 hours later, they're still checking in because they
Mm.
stopped talking about, holy hell, this is what we're noticing about ourselves. And then of course, the human capital people wanted me to create a diagnostic, or let's create a strategic plan. No, we'll go back and ask these people, where would you like to begin? It doesn't matter to me where you begin. You're the one starting. Where do you want to start? Well, let's start here. Great. So what do you need? So it's all dialogical inquiry. And
Mm.
so I've got all my degrees, all my writing, everything in the background. I'm now equipping the human capital team to do the same. And I said, but I don't know what that you're going to need, so I'm not going to teach you anything. You're going to bump into stuff about yourself, about each other. We taught them a few rudimentary speed coaching skills to kind of help them accelerate their capacity to be in conversation. And 3 months later, they had moved the needle on all the key metrics they were looking at. And then we used that as a prototype. And then we did 9 major projects over 3 years, all to deliver a business or structural outcome.
Mm.
There was no, except for work we did with the human capital team um, to equip them to work this way. But then I think like the first demo, even for them, was not training. I got the head of the department, the division that sponsored my first efforts, who had turned down the role of being CEO of the firm. So I interviewed him. They didn't even know who I was. They're all gathered. I show up and I'm interviewing Luke right in front of them. And they're like, "Oh my God, how could he do that?" And so I just asked, and after we did pleasantries, I asked Luke, "So tell us more about your journey to turn down that role. You seemed so poised for that and so ready for that." And he told this really moving story about he had a daughter, their newest child had some significant disabilities. And he said, "It's not fair to my family for me to be away that much until we kind of figure out how to support my wife and support my daughter." And he's a pretty kind of he's an accountant, a pretty kind of dude, but he had tears in his eyes, and because the room's all totally in tears. And then
Mm.
how did you do that? And I said, I didn't do anything,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
He did. And so yeah.
David, can I ask you a question? Like, how did you? I'm sure our listeners are fascinated. How, how did you transmit your thoughts to your first student? Like, how did that happen? How did you, like, was it the thinking and the writing? And then, hey, I want to because I imagine people would be super curious. Okay, like what you say about leadership, what you say about development is really fascinating. How did that happen for you? Like, did you start just, was it sort of mentoring another coach or?
No, I think it was it's a lot of things. I think I tried twice to teach in an MBA program. Once under a wonderful woman, Carolyn McKnight, at PSU in Portland, and I loved working with her. Really bright woman, great students. But I just realized, that just wasn't for me. And I had a breakthrough moment, to answer your question, Matt. Um, I did a lot of work for the federal Head Start program in the country, and almost won a federal contract for that. And somehow the money went to a Bush colleague in Houston. But anyways, but in that, I did a program on leadership through one of the universities for about 100 of these leaders from all the different programs across the American West. And I knew many of them from other things we had done. And I had built this extraordinary 3-day leadership program. And this was where I really, that was what everything broke open for me after this. And we're about 2 hours into this, and I know these people. I mean, I have a good relationship with these people, and I look at their faces and they're bored. Like, and I'm trying to panic, and I do what a lot of us do in that case. I tried harder. I said, no, I have to do something else. And so I looked at the room, and I just did some quick math. And there literally was exactly 100 people in the room, including myself. 2 men, 98 women, probably 65, 70% of whom were not white. And so I just stopped. And I said to them, I don't think this is working. Is that the experience that you're having? And there, of course, particularly in some of their cultures, that you would never say that to an authority figure, especially a man. So I turned to a couple of people I knew for whom it would be safe to say that. And they're like, yeah, no, this is not working. And I stopped and I said, and so rather than try to do anything about that or justify that or apologize for that, that was back in the day before laptops were that, common and things. Back in the old days, we had binders like with printed curriculum. So I took my binder, opened up the rings, and dumped all the paper on the floor, and then dropped the binder on top. I said, we're not going to use any of this. And I had spent like 3 months of like 60-hour weeks building this thing, right? And then they're like, and then of course, then the sponsor in the back of the room is like, oh, like panicking. And I said, I got this. You know me, I've got this. So I turned to the group and I said, I'd like you to form little neighborhoods with people around you. Get rid of these stupid rows of chairs that the university set up. Nobody learns like that. We're not doing that. Form little neighborhoods with each other. And I said, I want you to tell, and many of them came like from the mountains in Mexico. They came from all over the place, all kinds of lifestyles. And I said, I want you to tell a story about who you saw as a leader in the community where you grew up when you were a child. Who were they? Why were they a leader? Why do you think they were a leader? How did they get to be a leader? What did it mean to be a leader? And again, I thought I'll give them 45 minutes or an hour. Again, 2 or 3, we had to stop for lunch. So like 2 or 3 hours later, they're still talking in these small groups. And then meanwhile, I'm using my lunchtime to say, okay, how am I going to spend the rest of today? And so then I said, well, I came back and I said, here's like 5 or 6 elements that are commonly part of leadership theories or leadership approaches. So I'd like you to then interview each other now and stay in your small group, create little working groups. And what is the inherent theory of leadership that's part of your stories? What did it mean to be a leader in your context? And so we basically got them to build indigenous leadership theories. And then we got them to meet up with other people from their own culture, to compare notes. And so they could kind of like sort of flesh those out a bit. And then I turned to them and I said, so we've got 2 more days. What would you like to do now? And so we basically spent 2 days problem solving their issues around leadership in their workplaces, but using their own indigenous theories. And I would sometimes, bring in a few other pieces that might be missing because this is not their expertise. It ended up being the most extraordinary time. And for me, to your question, a lot of this just came because I just got so frustrated by being stuck in boxes. And then I went from there and I did 3 massive projects for the state of Oregon to, like, again, rebuild entire functions this exact same way. And what I loved about that was they just said, come meet David and walk around, talk to us, tell us how we're screwing up, tell us what we have that we don't realize we have, and help us imagine a better way to serve the citizens of Oregon. And we had the woman who was probably closest in real terms to the governor. I became really good friends with her. So once a month, she'd come to my house. We'd pour a beverage and sit on my back decks and have our of free conversation for her. And I knew more about my state than pretty much anybody but the governor and her. And it was like a confessional, not like a confessional, but it was a sacred space for her where everything was sacrosanct. Nothing would ever leave that little cone of silence. And I found so it was for me. I'll fast forward to many, many years later. I was in Vienna, visited Freud's apartment. They had reassembled all but the one sofa of the original furniture from the original living room where psychoanalysis was born. You could feel it when you walked in the room. That's where Jung would sit, Adler would sit, Freud would sit. Well, years later, I read this quote in a book about a letter that Freud had written to a friend about his own frustration about already what was happening to psychoanalysis. And he said, I want to protect it from the doctors and the priests. He said, I want to create what he saw as a secular ministry of the soul. And that's what I've been doing ever since. I don't advertise that because it's odd language to many people. But the soul is collective, it's personal, it's systemic, it's a lot of things. And so for me, I like being able to wander around and find out where can I bring healing, wholeness, clarity, courage, whatever the system is.
So I have a question, David. How does one bill a client for being a secular ministry of the soul?
So I always ask them that. How do I need to describe myself so I get paid? And then we'll make a deal on the side of what I'm actually going to do. Because they often, especially for government projects, you have to fit in some pretty narrow alleyways. And so I said, you come up with that other whatever voodoo language you need to get your contract across the line for your sake and for mine, and then we'll make a plan based on what we're actually going to do. And as long as we get outcomes, no one's going to care, and they never did. And for me, in terms of, you talked earlier, Matt, about transmission. For me, it's like I spent a lot of years studying Taoism. So one of the unique things about narrative coaching and all my work is it's very attentive to the environment. So rather than the more Western masculine way of I'm doing coaching, I say we are coaching. And we do a lot to help people notice their own environment in new ways. And then what is your environment telling you? So we have this phrase, this moment is your curriculum. What is it asking you to learn? So when I do programs, we don't have any curriculum. We can create some if somebody needs that, a structure, a framework, but most of the time, most of that stuff's not useful. It's just so like when I replaced McKinsey, part of the way they could justify that was I said to them, your partners are talking all the fancy McKinsey terms, but their behavior has not changed at all.
Sounds like they've just figured out how to parrot the right words, very similar to elementary school.
Yeah, they sound cool and hip, and it's great, but their behaviors and mindsets are
David, if you had to design your ideal coach, like for you,
for me,
how would you? What qualities would you like? Hey, look, these are must-haves for my coach, or my person.
So it would have to be somebody that can hold the big picture and not doesn't need to operate in a straight line, because I don't. Somebody that allows me to find my way to what feels true to me. I'm a social introvert, so I'm very reflective and quiet, but I also use talking to process and discover what I think. I use writing to discover what I think. Somebody that isn't that interested in questions, but is more interested in witnessing and observation, and then speaks to the truth of that. It's somebody that doesn't feel like a coach, frankly. I think about dear friends I've had in my life who've been that way for me. And again, I feel like sometimes we work too hard to seem like a coach. And I don't think that's very helpful. coaching is a made up construct. It doesn't exist. We call ourselves coaches so we get paid. And so we get permission to go do cool things with people and help them live better lives and have better organizations. So it's good work. But I've just find, like, for me, I just tell people, I've never taken a coaching program in my life. I've taught them for 25 years, but and there are a lot of great programs. David, you in one of them, but for me, that just sitting still was I don't know. I'm an adventurer. I've read probably 3,000 books in my life, and so I need somebody that can hold space for me to do that until I find my truth. And if I don't find it, somebody will hold up a mirror to help me see it.
You mentioned books. What would you recommend? Like, someone's curious about this, maybe even something you've written, David. Like, where would you suggest our listeners start if they're like, okay, you got me. I'm super curious.
Yeah.
I've seen the limitations. Where should I start?
Well, I wrote an academic, but it's a good book. It's a little bit academic now, but on narrative coaching. It's just called Narrative Coaching. I have a new book that will be out this summer called The Five Maturities, which is helping us move to a post-competency framework for coaching and talk about the impact of AI in coaching. So that's coming out soon. That would be my most current thinking. I've had long COVID for 3.5 years, was quite ill for part of that, and still have lingering anomalies. But I've recovered enough I can write again. So that's how I can finish this book. And I'm going to write sort of a legacy series on all 4 bodies of work using the same kind of format. And so, there'll be one on integrative development, which is the learning and development theory that will be out next after this one. And then that will be followed by one on narrative release, which is the spiritual foundation for all of this work. That also addresses things like grief and trauma and attachment theory, et cetera. And then there's one on narrative coaching, right? Sort of a take 25 years later about what do I think about narrative coaching now? Yeah. So.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah.
Dave, what are your thoughts?
Every time I have a conversation with David, which has been over the years in different places, there's this instant diving into like meaningful conversation. And there's something that you said today that really stuck out for me is the foundation of profound silence,
Mm.
and then not defining who you need to be
Mm-hmm.
in that space.
Yeah.
Right. And I love that you said that. And I think it's foundational for new coaches to learn and embrace that.
Yeah.
I think for me, my sort of insight was after we were talking, we have, for those of you who don't know, behind the scenes, we've got questions. I thought I'm going to get rid of those questions and just actually pay hyper attention and just ask the next one. And I think also for me, David, I think there's something about, as a coach, there's something about maintaining this instrument so I can really pay attention to other people. That was something I really didn't think about when I sort of thought I wanted to be a coach. Is this thing right here? I'm sort of referencing just for the listeners, my whole body, body, mind, soul, spirit, all of the hey, this is fundamental to my capacity to really pay attention and listen well. And just would have never have thought that. And I never would have thought that maintaining and growing that capacity is a lifelong practice. So anyway, I just that's what I heard.
Yeah, and it's even in that, every wound has a gift, but also every gift has a wound. So part of why I moved to silence is because it was better for me, and for a lot of reasons. And so for me, I think one of the things in the new book, and one of the things I really advocate, to your point, David, is I think we often teach coaches incorrectly. And so oftentimes when I used to do more like introductory coaching skills programs for organizations or groups of people, we would just have them sit across from each other for 10 minutes and say nothing, or watch somebody talking about a problem in their life and say nothing, and or watch two people having a coaching conversation and say nothing. And what we found was like, oh my God, and all these things they saw and felt, and so most of what um, I study all this stuff, but mostly so I understand why it is that what I'm observing to be true is true, or why it's effective. Oh, the theory says this, or the research says this, or there's people thinking about this. There's language for that. But mostly it's just I try to keep the conversations I'm in with client as simple and as grounded and direct and immediate as possible. And so no need to learn new vocabulary, no need to. So I'm working with 3 AI and coaching startups, using my work to design some really cool platforms that are kind of taking some of the AI work in a different direction, which I'm really excited by. And part of it is me figuring out how do I translate who I am, not just what I know, into a platform, and what is that like? So that for me is an extraordinary intellectual saga. Yeah,
Mm.
yeah.
David, if some of our listeners wanted to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to get a hold of you? Or
Yeah, so we have 2 websites. We had a lot of vendor issues at the start of the year, so the websites are quite simple at the moment, but you can still find me there. So one is for the Moment Institute. It's the place where we do our training and stuff. And but just there, we're not doing programs anymore. I'm using my own work to redesign that. It's now an open source membership community where we're encouraging people to take the materials and go create things, and then come back and tell us. Because the world doesn't need any more programs. It needs solutions it doesn't have. And so the momentinstitute.com is where you can find that. And then there's now a new site that I'm building, which is my name, David B. as in Drake.com. And that's where I offer my own advisory and coaching services. Yeah.
well, we really appreciate your time, and we are so glad we connected with you in Boston. Anyway, I would just encourage our listeners, find David, find his writing. You can actually purchase it, read it, study it, interact with him. He's open, and so I just would really encourage them to seek that out, especially if you're very curious about just a new way of thinking about coaching or listening. Until then, it's great to have you all. Hope you like or subscribe. We would really appreciate that. And until next time. Thanks for listening. If you love this podcast, please share it with another coach or leader. Make sure you go to the show notes to get all the resources from today's episode.